Welcome. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. Thank you for joining us today. I'm your host, Daniel Davis. I'll tell you, every once in a while, something comes along that kind of stirs and awakens me, especially as you take a look at this upcoming election. You kind of hear everybody volleying things back and forth about what they're going to do. It's always, we're going to cut taxes, we're going to work on Medicare, what should we do about the war in Iraq? And it goes on and on and on. How much is each person spending to be able to get that particular post known as the United States presidency, probably the most powerful position on the planet? But you don't see anybody really looking into the deeper issues about the strength of America. You know, what really is going on with our country? Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program is author of a new book called The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years, simply titled Brothers. And this was a time when two brothers were trying to basically rise up against the American system, or let's say engine, if you will, and really trying to change the course of history, especially with the American experiment. Joining us today is the author of this book, David Talbot. We're going to discuss Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years. And David Talbot, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today.
My pleasure, Daniel.
You know, it's really an interesting book. I picked it up, and it's one of those that just rivets you right in. Now, the first thing I just have to ask, because there are so many books that especially are written about John Kennedy, or John F. Kennedy, if you will, is, you know, how much of the information in this book is true?
How much in my book is true, or those
yes.
books?
I just have to ask because it's one of them particular presidencies, not that too many of them aren't, but it seems fraught with so much conspiracy, you just kind of wonder, you know, how much of it really is, you just have to ask yourself that.
No, it's a very good question, actually, because not only are a lot of Kennedy books marred by conspiratorial speculation, but there's a lot of, obviously, sensational and often unsubstantiated material in these books about Kennedy's love life and all of that. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's a great place to begin. And what I wanted to do as a journalist, and I've been a journalist for over 25 years, is to follow journalistic rules, have multiple sources for everything I put in the book, to have it thoroughly documented and thoroughly footnoted. And basically, I wanted to base this book on the testimony of the people themselves who'd worked for the Kennedy brothers, from Robert McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, on down. So I think the book stands the test of scrutiny. It's not filled with innuendo or speculation. And the main thing that I wanted to do was to follow Bobby Kennedy's own path into the killing of his brother, because I thought Robert Kennedy, his light into that dark tunnel, has a lot to show us. No one had ever done that. No one had ever tried to explain the mystery of Robert Kennedy after Dallas. What did he or did he not do to solve the murder of his brother? And so I wanted to keep this book as closely to as I could to a documented path that Bobby Kennedy took in the hours and days and years after the death of his brother.
Now, it's really interesting, too, because in this particular book, I noticed that you not only portray a hopeful picture of what John F. Kennedy was trying to do with his presidency, along with his brother as Attorney General, but at the same time, you also say, well, you know, Kennedy in many ways was flawed just like probably anybody else. So I found a really unique balance that you were striking there versus somebody might shed the light and say this guy was the greatest guy on the planet. We're not going to talk about the bad things he did. Or on the other hand, we're going to, you know, this guy was a crook, for instance, if you want to talk about Richard Nixon. We're going to paint the dark side, but then on the other hand, we're not going to show you any of the good things they try to do. But you really, to me, as I was reading this book, seemed to strike a balance of showing both and just what a tumultuous time, especially in their particular time, that the 1960s, even the 50s were, because America, especially coming out of World War II, after FDR stepping down, then you have the rise of Eisenhower. there was this projection of a Cold War. We seem to have won World War II, so to speak, but now we're in this weird, chilling Cold War. And America, certainly anybody ever remembers, especially when you think about Joe McCarthy and the witch hunts of communism, America and this right wing seemed to become extremely paranoid, and it seemed to be everybody at the point of the sword.
Absolutely. It was a much more chilling, much more dangerous time than the one we're currently living under, despite what the administration says about the war on terror. We were confronting a country that had an array of nuclear weapons. We were locked into a seemingly endless Cold War with the Soviet Union. And there was an economic engine, as President Eisenhower told the nation in his farewell address from the White House, what he called the military-industrial complex, that was driving this Cold War onwards and onwards with seemingly no end. Because, frankly, as he pointed out, there was money and to be made, profits to be made from this Cold War engine. Mm-hmm. Obviously, there were real threats out there. The Soviet system was, in many ways, unalterably opposed to ours. They had established an Iron Curtain over Eastern Europe, and the people who were suffering under that were suffering truly miserable conditions. But what Kennedy realized was that the kind of nuclear brinksmanship which had gone on throughout the 1950s and would in his administration take the world to the brink over the Cuban Missile Crisis was just far too dangerous to not address. He wanted to find some way of de-escalating those tensions, and he wanted to find some way of opening up channels with Khrushchev, his counterpart in the Soviet Union, and even towards the end of his administration with Fidel Castro in Cuba. And by the way, Cuba was much more of a volatile hotspot in those days than it is today. It was really the Iraq of its day in some ways, where all these geopolitical forces were swirling around. But Jack Kennedy comes in, I think, determined, as I say, to reduce these nuclear tensions. In fact, his speechwriter and aide, Ted Sorensen, who has his own new book out now, told me when I interviewed him that he thought that was the primary reason John Kennedy actually got into the presidential race, was to try and turn around this nuclear game of chicken that we were playing with the Soviets.
Yeah, it was certainly an interesting time. Now, a lot of people remember, too, that here's John Kennedy. He was a young president, won by a slim margin, but was able to get into the presidency. He appoints his brother, and he basically has a staff. I think this day and age, it's almost rare to even see the kind of loyalty, what I would actually call, or as you described, a very fierce loyalty to each other. I mean, it was really almost a closed cabinet about getting things done.
Well, absolutely. It's a small staff to begin with, but then as the administration is beset by one crisis after the next, particularly with the Bay of Pigs, when the CIA convinces him that by backing this invasion we can easily topple Fidel Castro, it'd be a cakewalk, to use a term that became popular in our day, and Kennedy realizes the CIA has pulled a fast one on him, and that the invasion obviously bogs down, and he thinks that, well, they were trying to stonewall him into sending in the Marines and the Air Force, which he refuses to do. At that point, the administration, I think, breaks in two, and that's early on in his presidency in April 1961. And I think the presidency becomes a much smaller circle after that, because he doesn't feel he can trust then his national security team at the Pentagon and the CIA. And he actually turns more and more to his brother and a handful of other trusted aides like Kenny O'Donnell, Ted Sorensen. The Kennedy administration essentially becomes a family affair, I think, at that point. That's why this relationship between Jack and Bobby Kennedy is so historically important.
I know the term was coined Camelot.
That's right. Well, that was coined after his assassination when, in an interview that Jackie Kennedy gave to the well-known journalist Theodore White for Life magazine, and she told him how he always loved the musical Camelot and would listen to the soundtrack and so on from that Broadway hit. But more importantly in that interview was Jackie Kennedy's gripping, horrific account of what it felt like to actually be in the presidential limousine coming under fire in Dallas. And it was so visceral, it was so gut-wrenching, it was so graphic in her account. This is just days after Dallas. She's telling this to Theodore White, that Life magazine couldn't run it in full. It expurgated it, and all they focused on was this Camelot myth instead of the full, truly horrible dimensions of the crime and what it felt like, as she said, to be going into this sun-splashed plaza and suddenly becoming under fire. As others said in the motorcade that day, including Kenny O'Donnell or Dave Powers, it felt like they were in an ambush, riding into an ambush with gunfire coming from more than one direction.
I think what's interesting, too, is we talk about that particular day, which I believe was November 22nd, is the fact that as Robert Kennedy was looking into his brother's death, he seemed to, as you were saying in your book, feel a sense of personal responsibility for it because of his particular post. Describe that a little bit for us.
Absolutely. Well, as we were talking about earlier, after the Bay of Pigs crisis, Kennedy feels he can't trust much of his own government. He turns to Bobby more and more. And even though Bobby is Attorney General, and he has his hands more than full with the great civil rights struggles of the day, his brother gives him more and more a bigger portfolio, and more of it has to do with foreign policy. He essentially becomes an overseer of the CIA as well, Bobby Kennedy. In fact, his brother, JFK, wanted to formally give him the CIA post, but Bobby thought that would not be politically wise. But he essentially establishes himself as an overseer there, and he starts many of his days as he drives into work from Virginia to Washington by stopping by Langley, the CIA headquarters, and snooping around to make sure that CIA was following his brother's directives. The CIA, of course, is a very labyrinth and secretive organization by its very nature, and they resented these intrusions from the Kennedy brothers, particularly from young Bobby, who they felt was in over his head. Mm-hmm. And the CIA Old Boy Network was furious about this. But JFK simply felt he couldn't trust them, and he wanted Bobby to be his surrogate and to take charge of more and more of the government. So when this terrible news comes back to him from Dallas that day, and Bobby is at home having a luncheon meeting in McLean, Virginia, the Hickory Hill, it was called, the estate where he lived with his family, he immediately not only concludes that it's a conspiracy and that he looks into the CIA, in fact, right away as a possible culprit, but he blames himself, as you say, because he felt he should have been on top of this. Mm-hmm. He thought the plot had come out of the CIA's secret operation against Cuba, an operation that, by the way, that had recruited the mafia. The CIA had recruited the mafia, we now know, from the Church Committee hearings in the 1970s to try and kill Fidel Castro. Well, Bobby Kennedy thought this plot had somehow gone awry, this operation, and that it had snapped back at his own brother. And he did blame himself. And in the days after, when this initial frenzy of activity where he tries to get at the bottom of the crime, when that begins to subside and he has more time to reflect, he sinks into a deep, terrible depression, a long night of the soul for Bobby Kennedy that lasted weeks and months, and really till the end of his life in some ways, almost 5 years later, because he did blame himself, which is true to Bobby's character. He thought he should have been in charge. He thought he should have seen this coming. He thought he should have taken care of his brother.
Mm-hmm. I know what's really interesting, too, just touching on that particular note, is when you take a look at the Kennedy dynasty, if you will, and how it was built by their father, and you begin to realize, well, gee whiz, America may have been founded on the premise of the doctrine simply known as the Constitution, and as wonderful as it all sounds, you see some really deeply embedded hidden ghosts. For instance, as you were talking about the CIA, here is a government agency that literally just decides, well, we're going to do whatever we want. You talk consistently about the insubordination of the CIA agency. You talk about the potential and even at times insubordination of our own American military, as you would call them, the Washington hardliners, if you will. These are the old generals that still believe that the government seemingly should be run by the military and not the other way around. Bobby Kennedy begins to understand, even though he's in this post as Attorney General, he's really trying to take down as you were saying, the mob in the book, trying to really get the CIA either in order, just break them apart. And then he becomes aware, after he's going after these main godfathers and gangsters, whether it's New York, Florida, along the East Coast, is that he realizes corruption really runs deep, and it almost seems to be the thread of the American fabric. And the funny thing is that's how their father actually rose to wealth. And Bobby kind of also took the responsibility of bringing in his own personal integrity to simply say, well, maybe that's how we got here, but I'm going to be sure that we start doing the right thing from now on. And that's just an incredible stroke when you consider that in a way you might feel kind of disloyal to your own father.
Well, it is. It's an amazing story, not only politically, but as you say, as a family drama. There's something almost Oedipal about Bobby back in the 1950s when he really bursts on the scene in American public life as a young, crusading investigator for the Senate Rackets Committee, going after this corruption in the underworld that has begun to seep into the mainstream arenas of power in America, how the mafia is beginning to establish links and control over much of the labor movement, like Jimmy Hoffa's Teamsters Union, into the higher places in government even, in politics, and into corporations. And so Bobby Kennedy's hearings in the 1950s under Senator McClellan are aimed at exposing these many tentacles of corruption that are now reaching into the highest places in American public life. And you're right, of course, in his investigations, it's like a movie. He comes across evidence that his own father, the patriarch of the family, old Joe Kennedy, who's clawed his way to the top on Wall Street and Hollywood and in bootlegging during the Prohibition period, he sees evidence of his father's own corruption too, which I think, devastated Bobby. He deeply loved his father. His father was utterly devoted to the children in that family. You read the correspondence he writes to his kids as they're growing up. And he, even more than Rose Kennedy, the mother, is kind of the mother hen who's always looking after his kids, particularly the boys, and guiding them and nurturing them. And so for Bobby to find evidence that his own father is part of this web of corruption was truly devastating to him. And I do feel that when he then devoted himself as a Senate Rackets investigator and then later as Attorney General under his brother to fighting organized crime, in some way he's trying to remove the stain from his own family. Mm-hmm. And he was determined not to cut any favors, any slack for these organized crime chiefs, many of whom felt that the Kennedys owed them. In fact, there's evidence that Joe Kennedy turned to some of them during the 1960 presidential campaign and solicited their help to get Jack elected. There's no evidence that Bobby knew or participated in that, but he certainly knew what kind of man his father was and what he had done to amass his wealth. So this is an amazing family drama as well as political drama. But then I think the Kennedys' great titanic struggle, as you also said, is to try and take the country to a different place historically on civil rights and the Cold War. These are the two great issues of their day. And it was particularly on the Cold War initiatives that they undertook, opening up these diplomatic channels to the Soviet Union and Cuba, the president giving a series of beautiful speeches that on war and peace that culminate with his so-called peace speech at American University in June 1963, where he says, we all inhabit the same earth, we all breathe the same air, and we all cherish our children's future. And this is his way of reaching out to our communist enemies and saying, look, it's important to talk to our enemies. And doesn't this sound familiar today? It's important to open up those dialogues if you want the next generation not to suffer what we've suffered. And of course, his generation, Jack Kennedy's coming out of World War II, had suffered so much, including the Kennedy family losing JFK's older brother, Joe, in action in Europe. And he almost meeting his death in the South Pacific as a young naval officer. So I think Jack Kennedy, deeply in his heart and soul, wanted to be known as a peace president. That's what he told his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. He wanted his epitaph to be, he kept the peace. But by doing that, he provoked a severe backlash from these hardliners in the national security apparatus in the government. Men like Curtis LeMay, who was the chief of the Air Force, top commander of the Air Force, who believed you could fight and win a nuclear war. He used to argue this.
Yeah, it was pretty crazy how these people were thinking.
Exactly. I mean, he was the basis for, Dr. Strangelove.
Right.
So, I mean, this is what the Kennedys were up against in those days.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not easy either, because they also looked at him as a young president. What would you know? What kind of experience do you have? We're the hard-spitting, fighting people of the military. We should know what's best for this country, as well as protecting it and winning wars. And it was a good reference to Dr. Strangelove, because you really see and understand the paranoia of the day and how you can easily be led to folly just based on that paranoia alone. And I think one of the most interesting things, too, is that as you were describing in the beginning of your book about Kennedy's assassination, and he had this back channel to the Soviet Union and to Khrushchev, is how the Soviets actually felt about Kennedy's death. Tell us about that and what their reaction was as they were talking about Kennedy's assassination.
Well, the Russian people and the Russian leadership were absolutely devastated by the news from Dallas. And, of course, the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald was being portrayed immediately in the media as a communist agent only disturbed them further. Bobby Kennedy, fascinating story that I tell in the book, and Jackie Kennedy both took pains to assure the Soviets that they did not blame the Soviet Union for the assassination, despite the way the media. And I feel, by the way, this is a CIA disinformation campaign. There's a lot of evidence that the people behind these stories trying to portray Oswald as an international communist agent were, in fact, part of a CIA disinformation operation that was attempting to pin the blame specifically on Castro and the Soviets as a way of provoking an invasion of Cuba. But in any case, Bobby Kennedy doesn't buy this, and the family doesn't buy it. And he sends, only days after the assassination, he sends a trusted family surrogate named William Walton to Moscow with a secret message for the Soviet leadership saying, "We don't blame you. The family believes it was a high-level domestic political conspiracy, and I'm going to try and get back to the White House, and when I do, I'm going to resume my brother's policies of détente towards the Soviet Union." This is a remarkable initiative for the Kennedy family to undertake just days after Dallas, because essentially, through back channels, they're reassuring the Soviet Union that at the height of the Cold War, that we don't think you were the culprits, our own government was the culprits, is what they're basically saying. At that point, the Kennedy family is putting more faith in our Cold War enemies than they were in their own government.
As you know, if anybody reflects on that, again, when I talk about Joe McCarthy and his Senate hearings on trying to chase down or witch hunt, as they call it, communists, and you think, this guy's an alcoholic. How is he getting away with condemning these people just mainly based on hearsay and no real factual evidence? And then you see, the Kennedy brothers, especially John, fighting against an old military system. And what's interesting about what you wrote, too, is the fact that John Kennedy wanted to assure that war would not be waged by building the military machine to such a level that it could never be used, and it seemed that his particular idea, if you will, had just the reverse effect, that it actually fed and it became more powerful to the point it almost seemed unmanageable for him.
That's right. Again, in my interview with Ted Sorensen, the president's legendary speechwriter, who helped him write, of course, the inaugural address with the famous line about "ask not" and so on. Sorensen told me, in his mind, the "ask not" line was not the most important line of that speech, but the line that said, "Only when our arms are of sufficient strength will we have the power not to use them," something to that effect. Your listeners, I'm sure, will recall the exact words. And so that was the Kennedy kind of principle, that we should build up our defense establishment, and as he did, to its highest level in history, because then we could be so intimidating a world power that no one would dare threaten us. And he thought that that was the path to peace. But as you say, the problem with that is that as you feed this beast, the military-industrial complex, in Eisenhower's words, and you give them more and more resources, then of course they become more and more powerful, not just internationally, but also in domestic American politics. They have huge lobbies, war lobbies. They own members of Congress. They go after the president politically, as they did throughout Kennedy's term, and called him weak on defense and so on for not confronting the Soviets in a more belligerent way, and Castro, and not invading Cuba. So they become a powerful voice for war in American political life. And they're rolling in resources and money, and Kennedy was fighting them throughout his administration.
You could just see, just simply by observing what seems to be common sense, how challenging it was to be John Kennedy, to realize that not simply that his country was against him, but it was the service people of the country, not necessarily just the military, but the people that are supposed to be in service for our country to both protect and serve us, again, as you relate to the Constitution. And here he's really fighting to be sure that that stays intact, to move toward peaceful solutions. We didn't talk too much, but for instance, when we talk about Fidel Castro, and then I'm trying to remember the other gentleman's name, Guerra, was that the right way to pronounce that one there?
Which gentleman is this?
This is the South American Latin leader, Guerra.
Guevara. Che Guevara.
Guevara, okay. And you realize that, here's this country that we were worried about the Soviets coming and occupying, but literally these two guys were saying, hey, look, we're really interested in a peaceful solution with Kennedy. We can pretty much guarantee that we'll not allow Soviet occupation here, so you don't have to worry about that. Let's just start talking. So you see these countries, as you were saying earlier, the Cold War people, if you will, saying, hey, we're all for the United States. We think this is great. We think that having peace is a good thing because we all want the same thing, life, liberty, and justice, and the protection and the love of our families. But yet our own United States didn't want this. And it almost seems that as you pay attention to that and you hear history repeats itself, you can almost see that that's exactly what's happening.
Well, absolutely. And in fact, there's a fascinating story I tell that happened early on in the Kennedy presidency when Dick Goodwin, who was a young White House aide who was a liberal guy and someone who took a strong interest in Latin America, and that became part of his turf in the White House. And he went down for a major conference in Uruguay. It was all the finance ministers from around Latin America had convened there. And, of course, the Alliance for Progress, the Kennedy policy towards Latin America, opening up a lot of foreign aid to those countries and challenging some of the oligarchies and the old power systems there, was very important to the Kennedys as an alternative to revolution. And Castro made sure that Che Guevara, his dashing and charismatic co-revolutionary, went to that conference as the economic minister for Cuba. And Guevara made a point of, at one point, showing up at a party at night where he knew Goodwin was going to be, so he could begin to have a back-channel discussion with him, an informal discussion at that very party. And there they are, as the samba music was playing in one room. Here's the great, legendary Che Guevara with his beret and beard, sitting on the floor with this young aide for Jack Kennedy, Dick Goodwin, and starting to talk turkey. Look, what's it going to take for us to, find peace with the United States? Mm-hmm. And it was the beginning of what could have been a historic opening for peace. But Dick Goodwin goes back and relays the news to JFK, but once it becomes public information, just like you could imagine in, say, a President Obama's administration, if he had a young aide who met with, say, representatives from Iran at a party in Paris or something, it became, the right wing went ballistic. These hawkish forces in American life went nuts. And how dare, this young Dick Goodwin, this young White House naive, inexperienced guy meet with, the infamous revolutionary Che Guevara and talk peace. And so the Kennedys were forced to back down from that. But they later reopened those same channels. And till the very end of his presidency, Kennedy was trying to find a way to come to terms with Fidel Castro. Because as he told one friend, look, if we get peace with these guys, we'll be selling refrigerators, and toasters.
Exactly. Commerce would be best in action served by American folk. Now, again, for those of you joining us, we're talking with David Talbot. He's author of the book Brothers, The Hidden History of the Kennedy Years. And it looks like we have a caller that has a question for you, David. Richard, welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program. Did you have a question or a comment for David?
Yes, I have a couple of them. First of all, is there any accuracy to the Kennedy assassination in the book by Joseph Bonanno and the movie by Oliver Stone?
Well, if you're asking, do I think was there any mafia involvement in the assassination, I do believe that. I don't think the mafia would have taken this on by themselves and orchestrated the assassination. Even the mafia, as powerful as it was in those days, wasn't cocky enough to do that. But they did play a key role. I think Bobby Kennedy believed they played a role. And I think he knew within hours, for instance, of Jack Ruby killing Oswald on national television. I have evidence, an FBI document, in fact, that I found that shows that Bobby Kennedy had sent an investigator to Chicago to look into Jack Ruby's underworld ties. And he knew that Jack Ruby had been paid off by associates of Jimmy Hoffa, the corrupt Teamsters leader. So Bobby Kennedy was a sharp guy. He knew where the bodies were buried, particularly when it came to looking into the criminal underworld. In fact, he also said when he saw the phone records of Jack Ruby in the days before Dallas, it read, he said, like his witness list for the Senate Rackets Committee hearings. He was calling all sorts of crooks and criminals before the president was killed.
Now, there's one more question I have, and this one is kind of... I was told once that E. Howard Hunt was the orchestrator of all of this, the assassination and the Bay of Pigs. Do you have any information to that effect?
Well, I'm very glad you brought up the name of E. Howard Hunt. He, of course, is the legendary CIA spy master who goes way back, and becomes very actively involved in the CIA's Latin America operations in the 1950s and on, and becomes particularly involved in the CIA's secret operations against Cuba. Hunt, remarkably, and then, of course, we know him as the Watergate plumber, the guy who was in charge of the Watergate break-in. Hunt, I think very strikingly, last year before his death in Miami, began a series of confessions to his son, St. John Hunt, his eldest son. And he does these confessions in the form of letters to his son, and all of which I've seen in video and audio tapes. And in these confessions, he basically says, I played a role, not a key role, according to him, but a role in the assassination of President Kennedy. He says he was invited to a CIA safe house in Miami in the summer of 1963, where other CIA officers are present, and the plot to kill President Kennedy is discussed. And he's asked to join the plot. He declines to play a central role, but he says he played a bench warmer role, in his words, on the sidelines, counseling people and helping from the sidelines. So this, to me, should have been screaming headline news all across the country. But the only publication, the only media outlet that I know that took any interest in this was Rolling Stone, which did a very good story, a human interest story, by the way, was an investigative piece on the relationship between Howard Hunt and his son, St. John, but it was full of interesting information. I go into this in the last chapter in my book, and I interviewed St. John Hunt. As I said, I saw the materials. I find this at least worthy of more investigation. Here's a former CIA official, very central one, very important one in the CIA's Latin America operation, basically saying that the CIA orchestrated the assassination of the president.
I'll tell you, you take a look at all of this and you kind of wonder, even as a citizen of America, whether you really even feel safe. There's this war on terror, and obviously seem to be doing the same thing back during the Kennedy administration, and you wonder if we've had any leaders, if you want to call them that, since then, who have rose to the occasion to actually make sure that the American experiment continues and how even people in our own country just don't want to see that happen. And you kind of wonder what direction at times is our country going when it seemingly seems to be imploding in on itself. I just have to say, what do you hope most that people take when they read your book, Brothers? What do you hope they most take away from this book?
Well, that despite all the Kennedy's flaws, and we've talked about some of them, the old man's history of corruption, the patriarch Joe Kennedy, and obviously President Kennedy, Jack Kennedy, had a number of personal flaws. Despite these, their heroism in confronting this war juggernaut, this kind of permanent machinery we have in our society. It's both comes out of the corporate world, these military industrial corporations that make so much money from war. They have their spokespeople in Congress and in their lobbies and in the media and Fox News and so on. I want people to realize the kind of enormous courage and fortitude it took for the Kennedys, both Kennedy brothers, to stand up against these forces of war and to begin a great debate about what America's role in the world should be in the second half of the 20th century. And that, by the way, is a debate that was interrupted by the assassinations of the two Kennedy brothers that needs to continue today. And I think that Barack Obama, by the way, has in some ways picked up that fallen flag. And when he opens up a dialogue, as he did during the primary campaign, about talking to our enemies and about finding new ways for America to occupy a position of leadership in the world, not dominating or threatening other countries, but
or even Americanizing other countries seems to be the order of the day. Yeah.
Exactly. That's right out of Jack Kennedy's playbook when he delivered the speech as he did at the University of Washington, saying, look, America is only a small percentage of the world when it comes to population and resources. We can't be the world's policeman. We can't fight every battle. We can't right every wrong. We have to have a sense of humility, about having so much power in the world. And we can't just go around exercising it in a indiscriminate way.
Right.
I hope that what people see now is that debate about what America should be, who we are in the world, needs to continue. And hopefully, if Barack Obama is elected president, that discussion will continue and America will get to the place in the world that the Kennedys wanted us to go to.
Well, exactly. You take a look at how we are in the world, and I think there are a lot of Americans that don't understand how others view us. And just as you were stroking very nicely in the book, Brothers, believe me, folks, if you read this, you'll begin to understand that who we are and where we are today is not by accident. You can see clearly that we're driven into a direction where underneath there's that feeling of paranoia, but don't worry, we've got our American military to be sure that you can feel safe. Well, if you didn't feel paranoid, you wouldn't have a reason to need to feel safe in the first place. So you can see how it's such a cyclical thing. And this book here, it definitely it just opens your eyes to realize it doesn't seem like we're any further now than we were then, and but that there is hope, hopefully, on the horizon. We've got another quick question here concerning Jackie Kennedy, and the question is why the records were sealed until 2029.
Her own records, you mean?
Yes.
Well, I think the family has a lot to answer for there, the family itself. Researchers are often frustrated when they go to the Kennedy Library by two things. One is how strange it seems government guidelines have even reclassified things under the Bush era that were once open on the shelves, on library shelves, and in fact have even been published in books. So there's obviously a kind of veil of secrecy that fell over a lot of research into government affairs during the Bush years. This is a family that's very committed to the reign of secrecy. But also the Kennedys themselves, I think in part because they've been so exposed to sensational reporting over the years, sensational journalism, some of which probably was just driven by greed on the part of the journalists, but some of which I think has a more sinister aspect to it. I think there was almost kind of a concerted campaign to discredit the Kennedys, to tear them down, to smear them, because in a sense then, if these people really were such immoral characters, who cares whether they were killed? I think that was the intent of that campaign in the media. But in any case, it is frustrating to get at some of these records. The family is to blame in some ways, the Kennedy family, and others, government bureaucrats. But these records should all be, open now. Everything. I mean, this has been decades, over 45 years now since the death of the president, 40 years since Bobby Kennedy's death. And one thing, no matter what you think about Oliver Stone's film JFK, pro or con, one thing that film did was to put enormous public pressure on Congress to release documents related to the assassination. And there was a huge avalanche of government documents that did become available to the public afterwards, many of which I used for my book. But still, maddeningly, the CIA still holds on to hundreds of key documents. And it's against the law, the so-called JFK Act that was passed by Congress after Oliver Stone's film. All government agencies, including the CIA, are compelled under that law to release all documents relating to the assassination. And it's, beyond time now that they should come clean about this.
I'll tell you, again, I can't tell you, it's been a real eye-opener of a book because basically what I knew, honestly, was more or less what other people said or what you hear briefly read about John Kennedy. But this book really, it draws you in. It gets you into the middle of becoming aware, hey, I'm in the same place now, it seems, as an American as I would have been then, except then there seemed to be more hope on the horizon, not only toward peace, but feeling that our government was trying to move itself into a position through its leadership of John Kennedy and of course, the support of the brother Bobby Kennedy, to a place where Americans could now feel that the government was in a position to serve them, which is what they were originally instilled for. Do you see that kind of potential hope on the horizon in the near future with, as you talk about Barack Obama, and some people are kind of worried about McCain kind of picking up the war machine and continuing, but is there that possibility that this can happen?
Yes, I do think there's a lot of hope on the horizon these days. In some ways, the campaign between Obama and McCain, as I wrote recently, is the re-election campaign that Jack Kennedy never had. JFK realized he was probably going to be facing Barry Goldwater, as LBJ later did in 1964. He knew Goldwater was probably going to be the Republican nominee that year, even back in 1963 before JFK's death. And he predicted that the major theme of that campaign would be war and peace. Barry Goldwater, obviously coming from a very hawkish military mindset, thought that the Kennedy policies were too weak and that the Soviets had to be confronted. He was for aggressively using the military against Castro in Cuba. And JFK believed the American people were on his side, that they were sick of war, sick of the terror, the duck and cover drills that kids had to do in those days in case of a nuclear attack, that people had been terrorized for so long and were fed up with living under that nuclear shadow. And he believed that the American people, and I think he was right, would ultimately endorse his peace programs and that he would be reelected. I think it would have been a close race, by the way. In 1964, it would not have been the landslide that LBJ enjoyed because of the Kennedy assassination. Mm-hmm. In fact, he knew that he'd lost much of the South, Kennedy, and because of his civil rights policies, he'd really split his own party. The white Democrats in his party were, adamantly opposed to his civil rights policies, and so it would have been a close vote. And that's why, by the way, he went to Florida and he went to Texas finally in 1963. Despite the warnings he got about going to Dallas, which was dangerous territory politically for him, he knew that he had to go to Texas because he knew that he had to win Texas in 1964. But it was not going to be a sure thing. I think it would have been a close race, but he would have won. Ironically, in some ways, I think this race, which is, I think, now taking shape along similar lines, war versus peace, aggressive sort of belligerent policies versus policies of diplomacy and discussion. I think this is going to be not a close race. I know a lot of people think it will be, and the polls show that it is at this point. But it was interesting to read Rupert Murdoch in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. And Rupert Murdoch, of course, the Dark Lord to many people in this country, the owner of Fox News, Fox Broadcasting. But even Rupert Murdoch, who's, I think, a shrewd observer of power, was predicting a tidal wave. And I think what he meant was a tidal wave in favor of Barack Obama. I think after 8 years of George Bush's policies, after the disastrous, not only foreign policies, but now economic policies that we're living through, that a perfect storm has emerged for the Republicans this year. And Barack Obama might very well be riding a huge tidal wave to victory in the fall. Of course, you can never say with certainty 5 months or 6 months before an election if that's true, but it certainly seems that way at this point.
Well, there's no doubt that what we're feeling in our hearts and spirits is the fact that it's time for a change. You know, the old boy network and the ideal of what seems to be the new American way of zero accountability for action needs to have some accountability coming back. And what I really enjoy, too, is as you read the book, Brothers, is that it's as you understand our history and where we have come from, when you truly understand it, and hopefully the listeners out there aren't just listening to media because there's a level of, misinformation, a huge level, in fact, that you get to a point you feel despair, like you can't do anything, but if you would just pay attention that you can do something. And just recently we had on our program 2 aides, security aides from the Clinton administration. They just simply said, look, if you want things to truly change, start electing better leaders. And the fact is we just haven't elected good leaders in quite a while. And most of that just comes from the fact that sometimes people seem to want to remain ignorant. And it's about time that if you want change, that you need to take responsibility for that change by understanding what it is clearly that needs to be changed. And certainly, David, this is one of those eye-opening books that can help people understand how to make better choices, especially when it comes to choosing a good leader. And I want to thank you for being on our program today.
It's been a real pleasure. I've enjoyed it.
You bet. Again, the book is Brothers. It's the hidden history of the Kennedy years, and our guest on the Beyond 50 radio program, David Talbot. And again, David, thank you for joining us. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you out there for the listeners who tuned in and with your questions and comments. And I want to encourage you to stay tuned as our upcoming show this Friday from 12 noon to 1. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us today. And remember, live your day past halfway.